When we talk about wanting to shape culture, and when we talk about wanting why stories are important, then that brings us to the question, which I get asked a lot: why are horror stories important?
What's up, Story Geeks? It's Jay Sherer. Should you approach horror differently, and how? Please bash that like button for me. And if you have any questions for Caleb or I as this conversation progresses, just leave them down in the comments and we'll reply. Links to all of the things that we talk about in terms of tools or resources will always be in the description down below. But let's dig deeper into horror stories.
It helps to know where horror fits. When we talk about wanting to shape culture, and when we talk about wanting why stories are important, then that brings us to the question, which I get asked a lot: why are horror stories important? And I have very close friends who I've had this conversation with them probably 3 or 4 times, because they are not yet convinced of why I think they're important, but there's something fascinating about the fact that I do think they're important, to them. So here is my attempt to explain why.
Yes, I want to hear this.
Why I think horror stories are important. Why do you want to tell stories that scare people? And there's a couple ways to think about it. I'm going to approach it from a couple directions, because it's an emotional state, so it's a little hard to talk about super clearly. But I think horror belongs to the same family of stories that tragedy and blues do.
Okay.
Horror is a type of lament that there's something wrong with the world. So, the opposite of tragedy is not happy ever after. The opposite of tragedy is hope. The reason a story is so tragic to us is because we know it should be better. That should not have happened. If we didn't have hope, then we'd be like, oh yeah, there's some things happened and then it was over, and we wouldn't have an emotional reaction. So we're hoping to the very end of Romeo and Juliet that this is not how it's going. We're hoping. Don't drink that. We're hoping you won't. You do. But I think what's interesting is that in writing a tragedy, the emotion that you're really eliciting in your audience is hope. And I think blues kind of does the same way. Blues as a music is it's the legacy of just the most horrific institution in American history, which is slavery, and the spirituals sung by American slaves eventually gave us jazz, and they gave us blues, and they gave us rock and roll, and any musical form that was invented in America basically came out of those roots. And so there's this horrible, horrible thing that happened and was being perpetrated against people. But the way that they defied it was to create something beautiful. A blues song is beautiful, even though it's about something horrible. It is a beautiful telling of that. And so the defiance is beauty. So you might say that the opposite side of the blues, what the blues are really invoking in people, is a sense of beauty amidst the ashes. And I think horror is the same thing. Horror is a lament, like that we shouldn't have to live in a world where we're scared. But we do. And I think the opposite of horror is not. So tragedy kind of leads us to hope. Blues leads us to beauty. And I think what horror leads us to is grace. Because we don't deserve to be scared, but we usually don't deserve the things that make us less scared either. You know what I mean? Totally. And to take this all the way back to Flannery O'Connor, and her moment, she said every story needs a moment, and she described that as being an offering of grace. But that's also why so many of her stories are described with the word grotesque. Just like look her books up on Amazon, or look on the back cover if you have any of them. The word grotesque is almost always in there. But she's creating moments of grace, but she has to do it with the darkness that surrounds it. And she has this great quote. She said, "The nature of grace can be made plain only by describing its absence." And then she has another one where I don't even know where I've. Oh yeah, so she said, "Is always an action that indicates that the devil has been the unwilling instrument of grace is what that key moment is.
Yeah.
And so it's this idea that we learn what grace is by seeing it not there. And when grace is not there, that's a frightful state of affairs. But if a story shows us how even the most horrific evil thing, Satan himself, can still end up, despite his worst intentions, being a delivery system for grace in a character's life, then it gives it. Then we are. I mean, it kind of leads us back to hope again, like with tragedy. It's like, you know what I mean? Oh, this thing that I realized I was missing as I went through the story and realized I was missing this thing, this grace. Now I realize that the things that make me feel so horrible and even the evils perpetrated in the world can somehow, and it's a mystery, offer me moments of grace. It can be invitations. And so, you know, there's a lot of horror films that I do not think are operating on that level. But I think that is why we tell scary stories, just flat out. I think that's why we tell scary stories, that just to say there are scary things in the world. But they don't have to have the final word. And so that's one way of looking at horror and why I think horror is important. Another is there's this artist. Oh, you know what? Here's what I'm going to edit myself. So I think so when we see that even evil can be a delivery system for grace, I think what that stirs in us is courage. That's what the word I was searching for. And so that's what horror films do. Even though we do not think of it this way, they encourage us, because the word encourage literally just means to wrap in courage. So they wrap us in courage because we know we can face this thing, because it does not have to have a nihilistic end. It can this can still be an outlet for grace, and so we have the courage to face it. And so there's a reason I just realized that. But Eric Fischl is an American painter, really. I think he would be considered an expressionist. Schools of painters are so niche that I wouldn't even venture to dare. But
you can say whatever you want to. I wouldn't know, so it doesn't matter.
There's a magazine in the 90s called Art in America, and he did an interview in it, and I have this magazine, and he talks about how traditionally in human history, now he uses Christian terminology for this because he's a Western artist, but I don't think that he means. I think he's just saying that in every culture that these are the functions of what art does. And he says artists have traditionally portrayed paradise, the fall, heaven, or hell. And the way that I like to rephrase those is what's right with the world, what's wrong with the world, how the world can get worse, and how it can get better.
Oh, I like that.
And if you're telling a story in the what's wrong with the world or how the world can get worse, you're going to be doing tragedy or horror, probably. And those should be horrific, but we need to be reminded the world can get worse. And we need to be reminded that even now there are awful things. And so sometimes a story just needs to remind us that we live in a world that has these four corners. Like what's good with the world, what's wrong with the world, how it can get better, and how it can get worse. We live in a world with four corners, and not every piece of art needs to show you all four corners. But I do think ideally that a artist's entire body of work should maybe show you the corners. The horror story can just be about how the world can get worse. That's all it has to be. It doesn't have to go farther than that, because that's something important for us to be reminded of. And later in that same interview, he talks about his experience looking at two pieces of art. One was a photograph of a man dying of AIDS in a hospital. And then one was the painting by Edvard Munch of his sister dying of tuberculosis. And he talked about the different emotions that those two created in him. The photograph of the person dying, it was just an immediate and quick exposure. Like, here's something awful. and it was horrific, and he wanted to leave it and not look at it.
Right.
And sometimes that's what we need to know. It's like, yeah, there are things you don't look at in this world because they're more comfortable, but maybe you need to look even just a little bit and know that this is real. But he talked about how Munch's painting of his sister dying, he literally uses the words, gave him courage. He said, because I had just seen that photograph of someone dying, and it was so horrific, and it made me think about facing death myself. It made me think about loved ones facing death, things like that. But Edvard Munch sat in this room with his sister dying long enough to paint this painting. He sat there and he captured the wrinkles of the bedclothes, the sun coming in through the window. In this moment, he sat there and he captured everything that was beautiful and tragic about what was happening. But paintings don't happen quickly. And so I knew that he sat there for a long time with someone dying that he loved. And knowing that he could do that gave me courage, because I thought, you know what, I can probably do it too. And I think that's another reason for horror to exist. Walker Percy, an American novelist, I think he won the National Book Award in the 60s for the novel The Moviegoer.
Very nice.
He has this essay called The Man on the Train. And to be honest, I've never made it all the way through the essay. The first 2 pages are the pages I can't get past, because the idea in them is so profound that I just end up staying there. And in the first 2 pages, he talks about how creating an alienated character, which is who his main character is in most of his books, including The Moviegoer, which is his most well-known work. Creating a character that truly feels alienated is actually a cure for alienation. Because if your reader is reading that book, then they think, this character knows what I go through, so I feel less alone. There's someone else. But not only that, this writer understood this character well enough to describe it. So there is another human out there who understands what I'm going through. And in that act, you are no longer alone. There are 2 other people. And so you are not alienated, because alienation is this sense of being cut adrift and on your own and isolated. And a story with a convincing alienated character has just cured that in you. Or at least been a medicine for it, and so I think horror films can work in a similar way, that people who are scared, and right now most of the world is scared, and I actually don't think our circumstances have created most of this fear. I think they've revealed it. I think people live with a lot of fear, and creating characters who are scared in those ways, but who persevere, or even who don't persevere. But again, if that character is scared the way you are, and there's someone out there who can write that character to feel the way that you feel, then you're a little less scared, because you know you're not alone.
Right.
So I think that is another purpose for horror.
I love that.
So I gave you a quick take on how to write horror, and then 2 big long versions of why to write horror.
No, I love it.
That's it for today's video. Special thanks again to Caleb Monroe for joining me. If you have any comments or any questions, leave them in the comments down below. Make sure you subscribe. We've got more great content about how to write and produce your very own science fiction and fantasy stories. You don't want to miss any of that. If you want to listen to the full unedited interview between myself and Caleb, go support us over on Patreon, patreon.com. You can support us for as little as $2 a month. It's a huge help to us, and we really appreciate it. I'll see you on the next video.